the 15th of December, 1967, 11:42 p.m. Staten Island, New York. Crime boss Vincent, the Fisher's Cafaro, was listening to his favorite late-night radio program when he suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to end his life. The soothing voice of WLUC radio host Johnny Midnight was discussing stress relief and relaxation techniques, but something about the specific words, the rhythm of speech, and the barely audible background frequencies was triggering profound psychological changes in Vincent's brain. Within 30 minutes, Vincent would write a suicide note, walk to his bedroom closet, and hang himself with his own belt, becoming the 15th organized crime figure to commit suicide after listening to LUC's Midnight Serenity program. What Vincent didn't know was that the radio station had been established by Lucky Luciano's successors as the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation in criminal history, using advanced subliminal messaging techniques, carefully designed audio frequencies, and post-hypnotic programming to drive targeted listeners to self-destruction while maintaining perfect cover as a legitimate community broadcasting service. To understand how Lucky Luciano's organization transformed radio broadcasting into a weapon for systematic elimination, you need to understand the revolutionary developments in psychological research and audio technology that were emerging in the mid-1960s. Military and intelligence agencies had been experimenting with subliminal messaging, frequency manipulation, and psychological conditioning techniques that could influence human behavior through carefully constructed audio programming that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. More importantly, radio broadcasting provided unprecedented access to potential victims in their most psychologically vulnerable states, alone, relaxed, and receptive to suggestion during late night hours. When psychological defenses were naturally reduced, and when subliminal programming could achieve maximum effectiveness, the radio industry also offered perfect cover for psychological warfare operations, because broadcasting licenses were regulated by federal authorities who focused on technical compliance and community service rather than investigating the psychological content of programming that appeared to be legitimate entertainment and public service broadcasting. Lucky had been developing this psychological warfare concept since 1961, working with European psychiatrists and audio engineers who had been researching advanced methods of psychological manipulation that could be delivered through mass media without detection by listeners or regulatory authorities. The inspiration for Lucky's radio assassination strategy came from his understanding of how human psychology could be manipulated through carefully constructed audio programming that combined subliminal messaging, frequency manipulation, and hypnotic conditioning techniques to induce specific behavioral responses, including depression, anxiety, and ultimately suicidal behavior. Lucky realized that radio programming could provide the ultimate psychological weapon because it could reach target individuals in their homes and private spaces where they would be most vulnerable to suggestion, and because radio listening was such a routine activity that repeated exposure to psychological programming would appear to be normal entertainment consumption rather than deliberate psychological conditioning. The establishment of LUC radio station required extensive preparation and over $3 million in initial investment that was channeled through Lucky's criminal network and laundered through legitimate media industry investments and FCC licensing procedures that made the radio operation appear to be routine. Commercial broadcasting expansion. The radio operation was structured through Metropolitan Broadcasting Corporation, a legitimate media company that secured FCC broadcasting licenses and advertising contracts, while establishing programming and technical capabilities that provided perfect cover for Lucky's psychological warfare activities. Meyer Lansky coordinated the technical aspects of the radio operation, working through connections in the broadcasting industry to obtain the necessary equipment, frequency allocations, and regulatory approvals required for commercial radio broadcasting and community programming services. Frank Costello managed the recruitment and training of radio personnel, ensuring that key positions could be filled with individuals who could conduct psychological programming while maintaining the appearance of providing professional entertainment and public service broadcasting to listeners who were unaware of the station's criminal purposes. The radio station featured all the standard broadcasting services, music programming, news broadcasts, community announcements, and advertising content. But the operation also incorporated sophisticated psychological programming capabilities that could transform routine radio listening into deadly psychological conditioning for targeted individuals. The broadcasting equipment was modified with specialized audio processing systems that could embed subliminal messages, manipulate frequency responses, and create hypnotic audio patterns that would influence listener psychology without conscious awareness of the psychological programming being conducted. The programming schedule was designed to provide legitimate entertainment and community programming to general listeners while maintaining specialized late-night shows that incorporated advanced psychological conditioning techniques targeted at specific individuals who had been identified for elimination. Most importantly, the radio station's programming documentation was designed to create legitimate broadcasting records that would satisfy FCC regulations and advertiser requirements, while concealing the true nature of psychological programming that was designed to induce suicide rather than provide entertainment. The recruitment of qualified broadcasting personnel required careful selection of individuals who possessed the necessary technical and communication skills, while being vulnerable to recruitment for criminal activities through financial incentives, personal problems, or ideological motivations that made them receptive to participating in psychological warfare operations. Dr. Harold Morrison was recruited as the radio station's programming director and chief psychological warfare specialist. Morrison was a 43-year-old clinical psychologist with extensive experience in hypnotherapy and behavioral conditioning, but he had been dismissed from his university position due to unethical experimentation on human subjects and was struggling to maintain his professional credentials. Morrison's recruitment was accomplished through Lucky's associates, who approached him with an offer to conduct legitimate psychological research through radio broadcasting while developing innovative therapeutic programming that could help community members deal with stress, depression, and behavioral problems. Morrison was initially told that WLUC would be conducting experimental therapeutic programming designed to help listeners overcome psychological problems through carefully designed audio programming that incorporated proven psychological techniques in a mass media format. The transition from legitimate therapeutic programming to elimination operations was gradual, beginning with requests for Morrison to develop programming that could influence listener behavior in specific ways, including reducing anxiety, improving sleep patterns, and encouraging positive lifestyle changes. As Morrison became more comfortable with behavioral programming, the requests became more specific and more obviously connected to harmful psychological manipulation. Morrison was asked to develop programming that could induce depression, create anxiety, and ultimately encourage self-destructive behavior in listeners who were identified as targets for elimination. Anthony Romano was recruited as the radio station's chief audio engineer and technical specialist for advanced psychological programming. Romano had experience with military audio systems and electronic warfare technology, making him ideally qualified for operations that required sophisticated manipulation of audio frequencies and subliminal messaging systems. Maria Benedetto was recruited to manage the radio station's audience research and listener identification operations. Benedetto's position allowed her to coordinate elimination targets with programming schedules and listener patterns, ensuring that specific individuals would be exposed to psychological programming that was designed to induce suicidal behavior. The radio elimination operations began with detailed psychological profiling and audience research that identified target individuals, analyzed their listening habits and psychological vulnerabilities, and developed specific programming content that would exploit their personal weaknesses and mental health conditions to induce self-destructive behavior. Vincent Caffaro's elimination was planned as a major test of the radio station's psychological programming capabilities. Caffaro was a Staten Island crime boss who had been challenging Lucky's successors' control over waterfront operations and building alliances with New Jersey families that threatened to disrupt the organizational structure that Lucky's heirs were trying to maintain. Caffaro was intelligent and normally psychologically stable, but he was also dealing with personal stress related to family financial problems and health concerns that made him potentially vulnerable to psychological manipulation through carefully designed radio programming. The operation against Vincent Caffaro was developed through extensive surveillance of his daily routines, media consumption, habits, and psychological stress factors that could be exploited through targeted radio programming designed to exacerbate his existing anxieties and depression. The psychological profile revealed that Caffaro regularly listened to late-night radio programming as a relaxation technique, particularly during periods of high stress when he had difficulty sleeping due to business pressures and family concerns. Dr. Morrison developed a specialized late-night program called Midnight Serenity that appeared to be therapeutic relaxation programming, but actually incorporated sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques designed to induce progressive depression and ultimately suicidal ideation in targeted listeners. The Midnight Serenity program featured seemingly innocent content, including classical music, nature sounds, meditation guidance, and stress relief discussions, but the programming actually incorporated multiple layers of subliminal messaging and psychological conditioning that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The subliminal messaging component included recorded suggestions that were embedded in the audio at frequencies and volume levels that could be processed by the subconscious mind without conscious recognition, creating psychological suggestions that would influence behavior and emotional states. The frequency manipulation component involved specific audio frequencies that had been identified through military research as capable of inducing anxiety, depression, and disorientation in human subjects who were exposed to the frequencies for extended periods during relaxed mental states. The hypnotic conditioning component incorporated repetitive speech patterns, rhythm variations, and linguistic structures that could induce mild hypnotic states in listeners who were already relaxed and receptive to suggestion during late-night radio listening. The combination of these psychological programming elements was designed to create cumulative conditioning effects that would gradually alter the target listener's mental state over multiple exposures, ultimately leading to severe depression and suicidal ideation that would appear to be natural psychological deterioration rather than induced psychological manipulation. Vincent Caffaro began listening to Midnight Serenity in early November 1967, initially attracted to the program's promise of stress relief and better sleep quality during a period when he was dealing with increasing business pressures and family health concerns. The psychological conditioning effects began manifesting after approximately 2 weeks of regular program listening, with Caffaro experiencing increased anxiety during daytime hours, sleep disturbances, and growing feelings of hopelessness about his business and personal situations. The psychological deterioration progressed gradually over 6 weeks of regular exposure to the radio programming, with Cafaro's mental state declining in ways that appeared to be natural stress, related depression, rather than induced psychological conditioning. By mid-December 1967, Cafaro was experiencing severe depression, social withdrawal, and recurring thoughts of suicide that seemed to be connected to his legitimate business and personal problems, rather than external psychological manipulation. The final psychological conditioning session occurred on the 15th of December, 1967, when Cafaro listened to a specially prepared Midnight Serenity program that incorporated intensive subliminal suggestions and frequency manipulation designed to trigger immediate suicidal behavior. The program included embedded commands encouraging suicide as a solution to stress and personal problems, combined with specific frequency patterns that induced profound depression and eliminated psychological barriers to self-destructive behavior. Vincent Cafaro committed suicide at 12:15 a.m. on the 16th of December, 1967, approximately 30 minutes after the conclusion of the specialized Midnight Serenity program that had been designed to trigger his self-destruction. The suicide appeared to be the result of business-related stress and personal depression, with a suicide note that referenced financial problems and family health concerns that provided completely believable motivation for self-destructive behavior. The investigation by Staten Island police concluded that Cafaro's suicide was the result of overwhelming personal and business pressures that had created severe depression, leading to self-destructive behavior, with no indication of external influence or criminal activity. The psychological autopsy conducted by mental health professionals found evidence of severe depression and stress-related psychological deterioration that was consistent with suicide risk factors, with no indication of psychological manipulation or external conditioning. The success of the Vincent Cafaro elimination operation led to the expansion of Lucky's radio assassination strategy to target additional crime figures throughout the New York metropolitan area who posed threats to his successors' criminal operations or could provide valuable assets through elimination and succession procedures. Over the next 18 months, WLUC radio stations systematically eliminated 23 major crime figures through psychological programming that induced suicide, severe depression, and self-destructive behavior that appeared to be natural mental health deterioration rather than deliberately induced psychological conditioning. Thomas Aboli was eliminated in February 1968 through specialized programming that exacerbated his existing anxiety about federal law enforcement investigations, ultimately leading to suicide that appeared to be motivated by fear of imprisonment and loss of criminal empire. Joseph Colombo was eliminated in April 1968 through psychological programming that intensified his paranoia about betrayal by criminal associates, resulting in self-destructive behavior that eliminated him as a threat to Lucky's successors' organizational control. Albert Anastasia's son Michael was eliminated in June 1968 through programming that exploited his guilt about family criminal activities and fear of continuing family criminal traditions, leading to suicide that appeared to be motivated by moral conflict and family shame. Frank Thierry was eliminated in August 1968 through psychological conditioning that amplified his health anxieties and fear of aging, resulting in suicide that appeared to be connected to depression about physical deterioration and mortality concerns. By September 1968, Lucky Luciano's radio operation had eliminated 27 major crime figures while maintaining LUC as a legitimate community broadcasting service that generated substantial advertising revenue and provided popular programming that served community entertainment and information needs. The radio operations had also provided Lucky's successors with detailed psychological profiles and behavioral analysis of virtually every major crime figure in the New York area, because audience research and listener identification programs revealed comprehensive information about listening habits, psychological vulnerabilities, and personal stress factors. More importantly, the radio strategy had created a climate of psychological terror among surviving crime figures who began experiencing increased anxiety and paranoia about media consumption and community activities that might expose them to psychological manipulation. The psychological impact of the radio eliminations was particularly devastating because they exploited fundamental assumptions about entertainment and media safety that made it psychologically impossible for potential victims to identify or avoid the source of psychological conditioning that was destroying their mental health. Federal law enforcement agencies investigated the unusual pattern of suicides among organized crime figures, but found no evidence of systematic criminal activity, noting that suicide rates among high-stress criminal populations were unfortunately common and consistent with known risk factors for self-destructive behavior. The FBI's investigation concluded that the suicides were consistent with normal patterns of stress-related mental health problems among individuals involved in high-risk criminal activities, rather than evidence of coordinated psychological warfare operations conducted through legitimate media organizations. The Federal Communications Commission reviewed WLUC's broadcasting content and found no evidence of regulatory violations or harmful programming content, noting that the station provided community-focused programming that served legitimate public interest and entertainment purposes. Mental health authorities examined the pattern of suicides, but found no evidence of external psychological manipulation, noting that the victims had shown signs of stress-related depression and psychological deterioration that were consistent with natural mental health problems, rather than induced psychological conditioning. Lucky Luciano's successors had created the perfect elimination system, a legitimate broadcasting service that eliminated enemies while providing community entertainment, maintaining regulatory compliance, and generating substantial advertising revenue that could be used to fund additional criminal operations. Through this radio operation, Lucky's legacy continued to influence organized crime elimination methods long after his death, demonstrating that his strategic thinking had created self-sustaining psychological warfare capabilities that could operate effectively without direct management or oversight. The radio operations established Lucky's posthumous reputation as the most sophisticated criminal psychologist in history, someone whose understanding of human psychology could create elimination systems that turned victims into willing participants in their own destruction. WLUC radio station continued operating as both a legitimate community broadcaster and a strategic psychological warfare facility throughout the late 1960s, with control of the operation maintained by Lucky's designated successors, who preserved the station's dual purpose while expanding programming to include additional psychological conditioning capabilities. The radio station's success established the template for criminal operations that exploited mass media relationships and community trust in entertainment media, demonstrating that true criminal power came from the ability to corrupt the information and entertainment systems that modern society depended upon for psychological comfort and social connection. Lucky Luciano had proven through his radio operation that the most effective criminal strategies were often the ones that appeared to serve community interests, while actually serving the criminal interests of those who controlled them through systematic corruption of trusted media institutions. On the 15th of December, 1967, Vincent Caffaro listened to what he thought was therapeutic relaxation programming, but was actually the culmination of Lucky Luciano's most sophisticated psychological warfare operation, proving that true criminal genius lay not in physical violence, but in the ability to make enemies destroy themselves while believing they were seeking help and comfort.